My name is Arthur, and I'll never forget the day my own children laughed at me like I was a fool. It wasn't a quiet chuckle, either. It was the kind of sharp, pitying laughter that cuts deeper than any insult. It happened right here, in my own driveway, the afternoon they delivered the wreck. My son Thomas, a man I'd put through college, a financial advisor who wore suits that cost more than my first car, just shook his head. "Dad, what is this?" he asked, not with curiosity, but with contempt. "You blew your nest egg on a tetanus trap. The scrapyard would pay you to haul this away." The sting of those words. It still feels fresh, even now. What would you do if the people you raised looked at you like you'd lost your mind? All for believing in something no one else could see. Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The thing they were laughing at was resting on the back of a greasy flatbed truck, a mangled skeleton of a car that had seen better days decades ago. It was more rust than metal, a twisted heap of aluminum and steel that looked like it had been pulled from a fiery grave. The Ohio sun was setting, casting long, sad shadows across the yard, and every shadow seemed to highlight another dent, another tear in the frame. This wasn't some casual purchase. This was it. This was the last of the money Eleanor and I had saved over 50 years of hard work. Every penny I had left in the world was tied up in that pile of what my son-in-law Mark called a good price on scrap metal. He even had the nerve to ask if I thought I could make $50 back on it. They saw junk. They saw a senile old man wasting his last dollars on a fantasy. They couldn't see the ghost of what it once was. They couldn't hear the story it was trying to tell. I watched their faces. It was worse than the words. Thomas, with his arms crossed, his jaw tight with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He was calculating the financial loss, the sheer irresponsibility of it all. My daughter, Sarah, wouldn't even look at me. She just stared at the oil stains dripping from the chassis onto the cracked concrete of the driveway, as if that was the real tragedy. Her shame was for me, and that felt like a hot poker in my gut. Mark just stood there with a smug little smirk, like he was watching the punchline to a long, pathetic joke. The air grew thick and heavy with their judgment. The family dinner we were supposed to have was forgotten. The silence that fell after their laughter was a verdict. It declared me incompetent, a relic, a man whose time had passed, and whose judgment could no longer be trusted. In their eyes, I wasn't just a man who'd made a bad investment. I was a man who had become one. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or try to defend myself. What was the point? They had already made up their minds. Instead, I walked over to the flatbed, the crunch of gravel under my old work boots the only sound in the yard. I reached out and laid my hand on the cold, dented metal. My palm, calloused and permanently stained with the grease of 1,000 engines, fit perfectly into a curve on the chassis. Right where the driver would have sat, I could feel something under the layers of decay, a faint pulse, a memory of speed and power. I felt the history in it. It was a language my children, with their degrees and their clean hands, had never learned to speak. I looked at the wreck, not at them, and I muttered, mostly to myself, "She's got a story to tell. You just have to know how to listen." It wasn't an excuse. It was a promise to the car, and a promise to Eleanor who would have understood. They left soon after that. The goodbyes were clipped and cold. No hugs, no "I love you, Dad." Just the sound of their car doors slamming shut, and the crunch of their tires pulling away, leaving me in a cloud of dust and silence. The flatbed driver, a young kid who probably agreed with my children, unhooked the chains with a sigh and lowered the chassis onto my driveway with a sickening groan of stressed metal. He took my cash, didn't meet my eye, and drove off, leaving me completely alone as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. There I stood, a 72-year-old man, with nothing to my name but a house, a garage full of old tools, and a mangled piece of history that my entire family considered garbage. The neighborhood lights began to flicker on, one by one, and I could feel the eyes of my neighbors peering through their curtains, whispering about the old fool on the corner and his new lawn ornament. The isolation was immediate and absolute. It was just me and the ghost of the racetrack. That night, sleep didn't come. I just sat in my old armchair in the garage, the single bare bulb overhead casting a yellow glow on the twisted metal of the chassis. The smell of old oil and rust filled the air, a perfume I'd known my whole life. It took me back. I wasn't born with a silver spoon, or any spoon for that matter. I was born right here in this little corner of Ohio, in a house that didn't have indoor plumbing until I was 10. My father was a farmhand, a man whose back was permanently bent from a lifetime of wrestling with the earth. He taught me that you don't get anything you don't earn with your own two hands. My first job, at 8 years old, was picking stones out of Mr. Henderson's fields for a nickel a bucket. My hands were raw and bleeding by the end of the day, but that nickel felt heavier than gold. It was the first thing I had ever truly owned. That feeling, that weight of honest work, never left me. My father wasn't a man of many words, but he had one passion he shared with me, the Midvale Speedway. On the rare Sunday he had off, he'd use his last few dollars to take me there. It was a world away from the quiet fields. The roar of the engines was a physical thing. You could feel it in your chest, in your bones. The air was thick with the smell of high-octane fuel and burning rubber, a scent that, to me, was more intoxicating than any flower. I'd stand there, a little boy with dusty overalls, clutching the chain-link fence, my eyes wide as those magnificent machines blurred past. They weren't just cars, they were thunder and lightning, shaped by human hands. It was there I decided I wasn't going to work the earth. I was going to work with steel. I was going to understand the magic that made those things fly. I remember one day, specifically. I must have been about 12. A new car had shown up, something nobody had ever seen before. It was silver, sleek like a bullet, and it didn't roar like the others. It screamed. It was an Italian car, someone whispered. It did one lap, faster than anything I'd ever witnessed, a silver ghost that seemed to bend the air around it. Then, on the second lap, it was gone. A plume of black smoke rose from the far turn. A crash. A bad one. They said the car was destroyed, that the driver was lucky to be alive. The silver car was never seen again. It became a legend, a ghost story the old-timers at the garage would whisper about for years. That image, that flash of impossible speed and sudden violence, was burned into my memory. It was the moment I fell in love with the soul of a machine. I started my own garage with nothing more than a set of second-hand tools and a loan from a banker who looked at my greasy hands with disgust. The first few years were lean. I worked from sunup to sundown, and then some more by the light of a single bulb. I fixed everything nobody else would touch: sputtering tractors, worn-out combines, family sedans that were on their last legs. I learned to listen to the engines. A car will tell you what's wrong with it if you're patient enough. It's a language of clicks, whirs, and groans. People in town started to know me as the guy who could breathe life back into dead metal. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was an honest one. Every bolt I tightened, every engine I rebuilt, was a promise kept. It was my word, cast in steel. It was during those early years that I met Eleanor. She was a waitress at the local diner, and she had a smile that could make a gray Ohio sky feel like sunshine. She saw past the grease under my fingernails. She saw the man I was trying to be. On our first date, I was so nervous I spilled coffee all over my only clean shirt. She just laughed, grabbed a napkin, and helped me clean it up. She never judged me for what I didn't have. She saw the calluses on my hands not as a sign of my station, but as a testament to my character. She used to come out to the garage late at night, a cup of hot coffee in each hand, and just sit on an old stool, watching me work. She didn't understand the mechanics of it, but she understood the passion. She understood me. I remember the night I asked her to marry me. We were sitting on the porch of the tiny house we were renting, the one with the leaky roof and the drafty windows. I didn't have a fancy ring, just a simple silver band I'd bought with money I saved by skipping lunch for 3 months. I told her, "Ellie, I can't promise you riches. I can't promise you an easy life, but I promise you this, my hands will always work to build a safe home for you, and my heart will always be yours." She didn't hesitate. She just took my rough, stained hands in hers and said, "Arthur, your hands are the reason I know I'll always be safe." I spent the next Saturday fixing that roof, and for the next 50 years I never broke a single promise I made to her that night. We built our life slowly, piece by piece. We bought this small house, the one I'm in now. I built the garage myself, from the concrete foundation to the last shingle on the roof. When Thomas and Sarah were born, my world shifted. Everything I did was for them. I worked longer hours, took on tougher jobs. I wanted them to have more than I did. I wanted their hands to stay clean. I wanted them to go to college, to have careers where they used their minds, not their backs. I bled and sweated and sacrificed so they wouldn't have to. I paid for every textbook, every tuition bill, every fancy suit Thomas needed for his interviews. I did it gladly. It was the whole point of my struggle, to pave a smoother road for them. But somewhere along the way, a gap formed. They went off to their universities and came back as different people. They talked about things like stock portfolios and marketing strategies, words that felt foreign in my mouth. My world of carburetors and gaskets became something quaint to them, something a little embarrassing. They loved me, I know they did, but they started to look at my life's work as a relic of a bygone era. They saw the grease as dirt, the calluses as a sign of a life of limitation, not a life of labor. They didn't understand that everything they had, every opportunity they were given, was built on a foundation of that very grease and those very calluses. They couldn't see the dignity in it anymore. Eleanor saw it, though. She was the bridge between my world and theirs. When the kids would visit and talk about their sophisticated lives, she would always find a way to bring the conversation back to something real, something tangible. She'd remind them of the time their father stayed up all night in a blizzard to fix the furnace, or how he rebuilt an old bicycle from scrap parts for Sarah's 10th birthday. She knew the value of things that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. She understood that the wreck in the driveway wasn't just a pile of junk to me. She would have known it was a piece of history, a puzzle, a final story I needed to uncover. She would have sat right here in the garage with me, with her 2 cups of coffee, and she would have believed. Her passing 5 years ago was like the main support beam of my life giving way. The silence she left behind was deafener than any engine. The kids tried their best. For a while, they'd call, they'd visit. But without Eleanor there to translate, we had less and less to say to each other. Their visits became duties. Their phone calls became chores. I became poor old Dad, living in the past, surrounded by his old tools and his old ways. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't sell the garage, why I wouldn't move into some modern condo. They didn't get that this place, this house, and this garage wasn't just property, it was my life's ledger. Every scratch on the workbench, every oil stain on the floor, was a memory of a problem solved, a promise kept. So when I saw the listing for the chassis, it wasn't a logical decision, it was a gut feeling, a pull from the past. It was an ad in a dusty old auto enthusiast's magazine, a single grainy photo with the caption, "Old racing frame, barn find, unknown history." But I knew. The moment I saw the curve of the frame, the specific way the cockpit was shaped, I felt that same jolt I did as a boy at the Midvale Speedway. It was a ghost, a whisper from a world that I still understood, a world my children had never known. Spending my savings wasn't a reckless act of a senile old man. It was an act of faith. It was me betting on my own history, on my own knowledge, on a lifetime spent listening to the secrets of steel. The day it arrived, and my children laughed, it hurt more than they'll ever know. It wasn't just about the car, they were laughing at my whole life. They were laughing at the grease under my nails, at the 50 years of hard labor, at the man their mother had loved. They saw a worthless pile of scrap, and in their eyes I saw the reflection of a worthless old man. They didn't see the story. They didn't see the boy at the racetrack, or the young man who made a promise to his bride on a rickety porch, or the father who worked his fingers to the bone for their future. They just saw a fool and his junk. And in that moment, standing alone in my driveway, I felt a resolve harden in my chest. I didn't need their approval. I just needed to prove it to myself. And to Eleanor. I spent the first week just cleaning. Not with power tools or harsh chemicals, but with soft rags, gentle solvents, and patience. It was like performing an archaeological dig. Every layer of caked-on mud and grime told a story of the years it had spent hidden away. I worked slowly, methodically, my old hands moving with a certainty that only comes from a lifetime of practice. My neighbors would walk by and shake their heads. I could hear their whispers through my open garage door. Poor Arthur, finally lost it. What an eyesore. His kids should really do something. Their pity felt like sandpaper on my soul. But I just tuned it out. I focused on the task at hand. The world outside the garage doors faded away. It was just me and the ghost. The deeper I got, the more the car started to speak to me. I found remnants of the original silver paint hidden beneath a crude layer of red primer, applied decades ago to disguise it. I found stress fractures in the frame around the cockpit, evidence of a massive impact. Each discovery was a small victory, a piece of the puzzle falling into place. My children didn't call. A whole week went by without a word from Thomas or Sarah. The silence was its own kind of judgment, a confirmation of their verdict. They had written me off. It was a lonely feeling, but it was also liberating. I had no one to answer to, no one to impress. The work became a meditation, a silent conversation between me and the machine. I remembered a promise I made to Eleanor years ago. We were looking through an old photo album, and she pointed to a picture of me as a young man, covered head to toe in grease, grinning like an idiot next to a hot rod I had just rebuilt. "You're never happier than when you're saving something nobody else thinks is worth saving," she'd said. "Promise me you'll never stop finding the beauty in the broken things, Arthur." I had promised her I wouldn't. Looking at the mangled frame taking up my entire garage, I knew this was the ultimate test of that promise. This was my last great restoration project. Not just of a car, but of a part of myself that I thought had been buried with her. And so I worked, day after day, night after night. The world could laugh, my children could forget me, the neighbors could whisper, it didn't matter. Inside the four walls of my garage, under the steady glow of that single bare bulb, I was doing more than just cleaning a piece of old metal. I was uncovering a truth. I was listening to a story that had been waiting half a century to be told, and I had a feeling, deep in my bones, that it was going to be a story worth hearing. The laughter would eventually fade, but the truth, once it's brought into the light, has a way of sticking around for good. The initial shock of their laughter faded into something worse, a quiet, suffocating pity. The phone call started a few days later, not with anger, but with a kind of gentle condescension that made my skin crawl. "Dad?" Thomas would say, his voice smooth and patient, like he was talking a child off a ledge. "Have you given any more thought to what you're going to do with that thing in the driveway? We're just concerned about you." They never called it a car. It was always that thing, that pile, or your project, with a heavy sigh attached. Every conversation felt like they were checking in on an invalid, tiptoeing around the subject of my supposed breakdown. They weren't mad anymore. They had moved on to managing the problem, and the problem, I was beginning to understand, was me. Their concern felt more like an indictment than care, a soft-spoken confirmation that they believed I was no longer capable of running my own life. The first big job was getting the chassis off the driveway and into the garage, out of the judging eyes of the world. It was a 3-day battle. I had my old chain hoist and a set of steel pipes to use as rollers, but the frame was awkward and heavier than it looked. My back screamed in protest, and my 72-year-old muscles burned with a fire I hadn't felt in years. I'd work until dusk, my body slick with sweat and grime, and then collapse into my armchair, too tired to even eat. In the old days, a job like this, I'd have had 3 or 4 guys from the neighborhood over, and we'd have knocked it out in an afternoon with beer and laughter. Now, nobody offered to help. They just watched from their porches or slow their cars as they drove by, their faces a mixture of curiosity and pity. The silence of my struggle was the loudest thing on the whole block. It was my neighbor across the street, Bill Henderson, who fired the first real shot. I'd known Bill for 40 years. We'd raised our kids together, borrowed tools, helped each other shovel snow. He walked over one morning while I was wrestling with a rusted axle. He stood there for a minute, chewing on a toothpick, then chuckled. "Hey, Art," he said. "You starting your own junkyard? Let me know. I've got an old lawnmower with a seized engine that would fit right in." He slapped his knee like it was the funniest joke he'd ever told. I just grunted and kept working, not giving him the satisfaction of a response. But the joke hung in the air. It was the first crack in the foundation of neighborly respect I had always taken for granted. The word was out. Arthur Vance was the local eccentric, the Newtown fool. Soon, the little things started to change, the small courtesies that greased the wheels of a small town. My morning walk to the corner store for a newspaper became an exercise in avoidance. People who used to wave from their porches and call out a "Morning, Art" now seemed intensely interested in their rose bushes as I passed. Others, like Mrs. Gable from 2 doors down, would cross the street, pretending they just remembered something they had to do. They weren't being cruel, not intentionally. They just didn't know what to say to the man who dragged a monument to his own foolishness into the middle of their tidy little world. I started to feel like a ghost haunting my own street, a person people looked through rather than at. The isolation was no longer just a feeling. It was becoming a physical reality, a bubble of silence that moved with me wherever I went. A week later, Sarah called. Her voice was full of that strained, careful gentleness she used when she thought I was being difficult. "Dad, I was talking to a friend of mine. She's a nurse," she began. And I knew where this was going. She said it's not uncommon for people, at a certain age, to make impulsive decisions after losing a loved one, even after a few years. She suggested I see our family doctor, maybe get a referral to talk to someone about making big decisions. The insult was wrapped in so many layers of fake concern, it almost suffocated me. She didn't think I was eccentric. She thought I was medically incompetent. She believed my grief for her mother had finally broken my mind. To hear my own daughter, the little girl whose bicycle I once rebuilt from scrap, suggest that I was no longer sound of mind, that was a deeper cut than any mockery. The phone rang again a few days after that. It was Mark, my son-in-law, the one with the smug smirk. He was trying to sound helpful, but his voice was dripping with condescension. "Hey, Arthur, just calling to check in," he said, his tone oily. "Listen, a buddy of mine and we have a cutting torch and a trailer. If you decide you want that eyesore gone by the weekend, we could come over, chop it up for you, get it out of your hair. No charge, just trying to help the family out." The offer was a slap in the face, disguised as a favor. He wasn't offering to help me. He was offering to erase my mistake, to clean up my mess, so the family wouldn't have to be embarrassed by it anymore. The thought of his cutting torch tearing into the delicate frame made my stomach turn. I just said, "Thanks, Mark, but I've got it handled," and hung up the phone, my hand shaking with a quiet rage. The invitations were the next thing to go. For 15 years, I'd been part of a weekly poker game. Just a few old guys, most of us retired, getting together in Frank Miller's basement. We'd play for nickels and dimes, drink cheap beer, and complain about our aching joints. It was a ritual. But the first Tuesday after the car arrived, nobody called. I figured maybe someone was sick. The next Tuesday, the same thing. Silence. I finally broke down and called Frank. He sounded flustered, made some lame excuse about his wife not feeling well and him having to cancel. I knew he was lying. I could hear the television and other voices in the background. They were playing without me. I had become a liability, the guy they had to whisper about after he left the room. It was easier to just not invite me at all. The loss of that simple camaraderie felt like a door slamming shut on my social life. The feeling of being an outcast started to follow me everywhere. I went to the diner for my usual Friday night fish fry, a tradition Eleanor and I had kept for 30 years. I sat in our regular booth, the one by the window. The young waitress, who always had a smile for me, seemed to avoid my table. When she finally came over, her notebook was already out. "Just the usual, Mr. Vance?" she asked, not making eye contact, eager to get away. I sat there, eating my meal in silence, watching families and couples laughing and talking. I had never felt so alone in a crowded room. The entire town seemed to have received a memo that I was no longer one of them. I was a curiosity, a story they told their friends. "You know old Arthur Vance? Well, you won't believe what he went and did." I was a character in their story, but I was no longer a part of their world. Thomas decided to stage an intervention, though he didn't call it that. He showed up one Saturday afternoon, unannounced. He didn't even glance at the garage. He just stood on the front porch, clutching a glossy brochure. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, his face grim. The brochure was for a place called Maple Creek Senior Living. It was full of pictures of smiling, white-haired people playing shuffleboard and doing water aerobics. "It's time to be realistic," he said. "This house is too much for you. The yard, the maintenance, and now, this." He waved a hand vaguely in the direction of the garage. He was talking about liquidating my life. Selling the house I built, the garage that held my memories, and putting me in a sterile apartment where I couldn't cause any more trouble. He didn't see a father who had made a choice. He saw a liability that needed to be managed, an asset that needed to be liquidated before it depreciated any further. My garage became my fortress. I started spending nearly all my waking hours in there, the big door pulled down to shut out the world. The work was my only solace. The rhythmic scrape of a wire brush against steel, the sharp, clean scent of mineral spirits, the satisfying click of a wrench finding its purchase on a bolt. These were the only voices I wanted to hear. They were honest sounds, predictable and true. Out there the world was full of whispers and pitying glances. In here it was just me and the frame. I'd lose track of time, working under the harsh glare of the single bulb, my focus narrowed to a single square foot of metal. I was cleaning away not just 50 years of grime, but the noise of their judgment. The garage wasn't just a workshop anymore. It was a sanctuary, the last place on earth where I felt competent and in control. Even acts of kindness became twisted into reminders of my new status. Mrs. Gable, the sweet woman who always baked an extra apple pie for me after Eleanor died, knocked on my door one afternoon. For a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe people still cared. But she wasn't holding a pie tin. She was holding a pamphlet from her church. On the front, in gentle looping script, it read, "Navigating Life's Transitions with Grace." It was a leaflet for grief counseling and support groups for seniors dealing with loss and confusion. She patted my arm, her eyes full of a deep, sorrowful pity. "We're all praying for you, Arthur," she whispered. She meant to be kind, I know she did. But all I heard was that the whole town, even the good-hearted church ladies, had diagnosed me as a pathetic old man who had lost his way, clinging to a piece of junk as a substitute for his dead wife. I made one last attempt to connect with someone who might understand. I ran into Jimmy, a kid I'd trained myself 20 years ago at the hardware store. He was a good mechanic, had a sharp mind. I thought, if anyone would get it, he would. I saw him in the aisle with the welding supplies, and I started telling him about the chassis. "Jimmy, You wouldn't believe the frame on this thing, I said, my voice filled with an excitement I hadn't felt in weeks. The welds are like nothing I've ever seen. Pinpoint precise. And the shape of the cockpit. I swear it's got Italian lines. I was babbling, desperate for someone to see what I saw. Jimmy just listened with a patient smile, the kind you give a rambling old uncle. When I was done, he patted my shoulder. That's great, Art. Sounds like you've got your hands full. Just take it easy, all right? Don't work yourself too hard on that old thing. He called it an old thing. The dismissal was so casual, so complete. My expertise, my life's knowledge, was now just the rambling of a crazy old man. The practical realities started to close in, too. A letter arrived from the bank, a polite but firm notice that my savings account balance had dropped below the minimum and service fees would now apply. The last of my nest egg was gone, and now the account was actively shrinking. It was a stark, black and white reminder of what Thomas had warned me about. In his world, this piece of paper was the final score. It proved I had made a catastrophic financial error. The shame of it was a cold knot in my stomach. It wasn't just that they thought I was a fool. I was now, officially, a poor fool. The freedom I thought I had purchased with that last check was turning into a cage of my own making, with financial bars I could see closing in around me. I had bet everything on my own intuition, and according to the world, I had lost spectacularly. The final humiliation came indirectly. My niece, Sarah's cousin, called me one evening just to chat. She was a sweet kid, and she let something slip. Aunt Sarah and Uncle Thomas are having a big talk about you this weekend, she said, oblivious to the bomb she was dropping. They're trying to figure out what to do. A meeting. A family meeting about my situation, and I wasn't even invited. I was no longer the patriarch of the family. I was a topic on an agenda, a problem to be solved. I imagined them sitting around a polished dining room table, my son with his spreadsheets, and my daughter with her worried frown, debating my future, my finances, my sanity. They were carving up my life, deciding my fate, while I was just a few miles away, completely unaware. Like a piece of broken-down equipment, they were deciding whether to repair or scrap. One night, I was working late, the garage glowing like a lantern in the dark. I heard a car slow down on the street. I glanced out the small, grimy window just in time to see a couple of teenagers pointing at my house. They were laughing. One of them leaned out the window and yelled something. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of their youthful, cruel laughter was crystal clear. It echoed the sound I'd heard from my own children in the driveway. It was the final confirmation. My folly had become a local landmark, a source of entertainment, a joke. Hey, drive past Old Man Vance's place. You gotta see the pile of junk he bought. In that moment, the weight of it all finally settled on me. It wasn't just my family or my old friends or my neighbors. It was everyone. The verdict was in. I was, officially and irrevocably, the old fool with the worthless property. I put down the wrench I was holding and sank onto an old wooden crate. The air in the garage suddenly felt thick and heavy, hard to breathe. For the first time since I brought the car home, a sliver of genuine doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through my resolve. Were they right? Was I just a stubborn, senile old man chasing a ghost? Had I thrown away my security, my family's respect, my reputation, all for a delusion? The silence of the garage pressed in, no longer a comfort, but an accusation. The isolation was now absolute. I was an island, and the sea of everyone else's certainty was rising, threatening to drown me. I looked at the twisted skeleton of metal before me, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I saw what they saw, a heap of meaningless, expensive rust. The feeling of despair was so heavy it felt like I might never get up from that crate. My hands, stained with a lifetime of grease and work, felt empty and useless. I had built a life on being trusted, on being the man who could fix things. Now I was the one everyone thought was broken beyond repair. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and laid it on a section of the frame I had spent the last 3 days polishing. The metal was cool and smooth beneath my calloused palm, and as my fingers traced the elegant, unfamiliar curve, I felt it again. Not a vibration, not a sound. Something deeper. A feeling of purpose. A whisper of a story that no one else could hear. The doubt didn't vanish, but it receded. It was pushed back by a lifetime of instinct. Let them laugh. Let them whisper, and plan, and pity. Their world was loud with opinions, but this world, right here, was quiet with truth. And I was the only one left who knew how to listen. It was about a month into the work, long after the phone calls had dwindled, and the pitying looks had become a permanent part of the neighborhood landscape. I was in the garage, the door shut tight against the world, working on a section of the main frame near where the engine would have mounted. It was covered in a thick layer of hardened grease and barn filth, fused together by 50 years of neglect. As I was gently scraping it away with a putty knife, my hand numb from the repetitive motion, the blade snagged on something. It wasn't a rough patch of rust. It was something sharp, metallic, and clearly man-made. It was a small, crudely welded plate, about the size of my thumb, that didn't match the elegant craftsmanship of the rest of the frame. It was an afterthought. A patch, and anything that's been deliberately covered up is something worth looking into. My heart, for the first time in weeks, started to beat a little faster. I spent the next 2 days on that one little spot. I didn't use a grinder or a torch. That would have been a butcher's work. I used dental picks and small wire brushes, the kind of tools you'd use to clean a delicate clock. I worked with a magnifying glass under the harsh light of my single bulb, chipping away at that ugly weld bead by painstaking millimeter. It was slow, tedious work. My back ached, and my fingers cramped, but I didn't stop. I felt like a safecracker, listening for the faintest click of a tumbler falling into place. The rest of the world, with its judgments and its timetables, didn't exist. It was just me, the steel, and a secret that had been welded shut half a century ago. On the evening of the second day, with a final, gentle pry, the plate popped off. It fell to the concrete floor with a tiny, metallic tink that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent garage. Underneath the plate, stamped directly into the main chassis tube, was a set of numbers and letters, clean and pristine, protected from the elements all these years. My hands were shaking so much I had to steady them on the frame to read it. AF001. My breath caught in my throat. I knew what it meant. I had seen grainy photographs in old, forgotten racing magazines from my youth. AF Argento Falcon, the Silver Falcon, and 001, the very first one, the only one, the legend, the ghost of Midvale Speedway. It was real. The silver blur that had seared itself into my 12-year-old brain wasn't just a story old men told. It was right here, in my garage, in my town. The car that had vanished without a trace after that fiery crash. The car they said was lost forever, destroyed beyond recognition. It had been sitting in a barn 100 miles away, waiting for someone who remembered. I spent the next week not in the garage, but in the local library's dusty basement archives. I pulled out every newspaper and automotive journal from 1967. I pieced the story together, bit by bit. The Argento Falcon was a revolutionary prototype, built in secret by a brilliant but underfunded Italian engineer. It was brought to America for a single demonstration race at Midvale to attract investors. It was faster than anything on the track, a technological marvel that would have changed racing forever. But on its second lap, a rival team's car, a much heavier and slower machine, nudged it on the turn. A, quote, racing incident, they called it. The Falcon, being lightweight and experimental, was sent into the wall at over 150 miles per hour. The official story was that the car was a total loss, the wreckage hauled away for scrap. But that wasn't the truth. The truth, as I uncovered from a small article in a trade paper, was that the rival team, the same one involved in the crash, quietly bought the wreckage for pennies on the dollar. They wanted the technology buried. They were terrified of what that car could do. They welded that crude plate over the chassis number, painted it a dull red, and sold it as anonymous scrap to a farmer who used its frame as the basis for a homemade tractor that never quite worked. It was then shoved into a barn and forgotten. For 50 years the ghost slept. My children, my neighbors, they all saw a pile of junk. They saw a bad investment. They couldn't see the history. They couldn't see the deliberate act of industrial sabotage, the story of a dream that was murdered on a racetrack and then buried in a barn. They saw rust, but I saw a crime scene. The biggest secret, however, wasn't the chassis number. That was just the beginning. I had a hunch. Race car designers in that era were paranoid. They hid things. I started tapping along the main structural tubes of the frame, listening for changes in the resonance, and there it was. A hollow section, right behind the driver's cockpit. That didn't ring true. It took me another day of careful work to find the seam. It was a perfectly machined access panel, designed to be invisible. When I finally got it open, my hands were slick with a nervous sweat. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry, crumbling insulation, was a long, thin tube made of oilskin, sealed at both ends with wax. It was perfectly preserved, waterproof, and airtight. I lifted it out as gently as if I were handling a newborn baby. It felt heavier than it should have, heavy with the weight of a lost history. I took the tube into the house, to the kitchen table, where Eleanor and I had shared thousands of meals. I carefully cut the wax seal and slid out the contents. It was a tight roll of vellum sheets, brittle with age. As I unrolled them, my breath hitched. They were the original, hand-drawn blueprints for the Argento Falcon's engine. Every part, every gear, every revolutionary concept was laid out in exquisite, precise detail, with notes in Italian scribbled in the margins. It wasn't just a car. It was the mind of a genius, preserved on paper. This was the Holy Grail. This was what the rival team had been looking for when they bought the wreck. They must have assumed it was destroyed in the fire. They had buried the body, but they had missed the soul. And now, that soul was lying on my kitchen table, glowing under the dim light. And in that moment, I understood why I had to do this alone. If I had told my children what I suspected, what would have happened? Thomas would have seen it as an asset to be appraised and liquidated. He would have called in experts, lawyers, auction houses. The story would have been lost, replaced by a number on a balance sheet. Sarah would have been consumed with anxiety about the publicity, about what the neighbors would think. Mark would have been calculating his cut. They would have swarmed over it, their clean hands touching something they could never understand, their minds seeing only a lottery ticket. They wouldn't have seen the ghost, the genius, the tragedy. They would have seen a payday. And that, more than anything, would have been the final desecration of the Argento Falcon. I was also protecting a promise I made to Eleanor. She was the one who taught me to see the story in things, not just the function. She would have loved this. She would have sat with me for hours, tracing the lines on the blueprints with her finger, imagining the man who drew them. She would have understood that its value wasn't in what it could be sold for, but in what it represented, a beautiful idea that was silenced too soon. To turn this discovery into a vulgar squabble over money would have been a betrayal of her memory, a betrayal of the very reason she fell in love with a man with grease under his fingernails. This wasn't about getting rich. This was about setting a story free. It was about giving a ghost its voice back, and that was a job I had to do myself, in the quiet of my own garage. So I worked on, in silence. The knowledge I held was a warm, steady flame in my chest. When Bill Henderson from across the street made another joke about my junkyard, I just smiled to myself. He was standing 20 feet away from one of the most important automotive artifacts in history, and saw nothing but scrap. When my daughter called to suggest I see a therapist, I listened patiently, knowing that the blueprints for a revolutionary engine were sitting in my kitchen drawer. The power shift was profound, but it was entirely internal. I didn't need to say a word. Their pity, their mockery, their condescension, it all became a kind of background noise, like the hum of a distant highway. I was living in a different reality now, one built on a truth they were completely blind to. To be sure, I had to know the real-world value. Not for me, but for the car's legacy. I found a lawyer in the city, an older fellow who specialized in estate and historical artifacts. I didn't give him my name. I sent him photocopies of the blueprints and the chassis number documentation through a post office box. I asked for a confidential appraisal for a hypothetical discovery. 2 weeks later, a thick manila envelope arrived. Inside was a detailed report from a panel of international automotive historians and auction specialists. They confirmed its identity and its one-of-a-kind status. With the chassis and the lost blueprints together, they estimated the conservative auction value at $111 million. I read the number 3 times. $111 million. I folded the letter, put it in the drawer with the blueprints, and went back out to the garage to keep working. My children had laughed at me for spending my life savings, a few $1,000s, on what they called a tetanus trap. They saw a senile old man making a foolish, sentimental mistake. What they failed to see was that my entire life had been an education for this single moment. The 50 years I spent listening to engines, studying metal fatigue, reading schematics, that wasn't just a job. It was my university. The grease under my nails was my diploma. My calloused hands were my credentials. They, with their college degrees and their financial models, could only measure value in dollars and cents. They had lost the ability to see value in anything else, in history, in knowledge, in intuition. They had underestimated the very man who had given them the comfortable lives that made them so dismissive of his own. I wasn't a victim of their mockery anymore. I realized I was the guardian of a secret. I wasn't a fool wasting his last dollars. I was an investor who had just made the most spectacular acquisition of his life, a return so massive it was almost comical. Every pitying glance from a neighbor, every condescending phone call from my son, became a private, ironic victory. They were all living in a world of surfaces, of appearances. They saw a dilapidated house, an old man, and a pile of rust. I saw a sanctuary, a historian, and a priceless artifact. The garage was no longer my fortress against their judgment. It was a museum, and I was its sole, silent curator. My solitude was no longer a punishment. It was a privilege. I thought back to Mark's offer, the one that had filled me with such quiet rage. His offer to come over with his buddy and a cutting torch to chop it up for me, to get the eyesore out of my hair. I pictured that torch slicing through the delicate frame, melting the metal around the hidden blueprints, turning a $100 million piece of history into a $50 pile of scrap. The ignorance of it was staggering. Their attempt to help me, to save me from my own foolishness, would have been the single most destructive act of financial and historical vandalism imaginable. They were so sure they were right, so confident in their superior judgment, that they were blind to the colossal truth sitting right in front of them. And so the power was mine, not the power to be rich because the money meant nothing to me. It was the power of knowledge, the power of vindication. The final act wasn't going to be a confrontation. I wasn't going to wave the appraisal in their faces, or demand an apology. What would be the point? They still wouldn't understand the real value. They would just see the money they had lost out on, and their regret would be as shallow as their initial mockery. No, the justice here had to be as quiet and elegant as the car itself. It had to be about the story, not about me. I now held the fate of the Argento Falcon in my hands, and I knew, with absolute certainty, what I had to do to honor it, and to honor Eleanor. The laughter had ended. The listening was about to begin. For a few days, I just sat with that number, $111 million. I'd write it down on a scrap of paper and stare at it. It felt like a word from a foreign language, something I could see but not understand. What does a man like me do with that kind of money? Buy a new house? My home is filled with 50 years of Eleanor's presence. Leaving it would be like leaving her all over again. A fancy car? I had the only one I ever wanted sitting in my garage. I pictured my children's faces if I showed them that appraisal. The shock, the disbelief, then the frantic calculations. The arguments would start immediately. Lawyers, accountants, advisors, they would descend on this quiet life I'd built and tear it apart, piece by piece, fighting over scraps of a treasure they never even had the eyes to see. The money wouldn't fix them. It would only make them worse. It would turn this beautiful secret story into a loud, ugly noise. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I couldn't let that happen. The car didn't belong to me, not really. And it certainly didn't belong to them. It belonged to history. It was a masterpiece that had been silenced, and my job wasn't to cash it in. It was to let it sing again. So I made a new plan. I called the lawyer in the city, the one who had handled the appraisal. I told him I wanted to make a donation, an anonymous one. I wanted the Argento Falcon, along with the original blueprints, to go to a world-class automotive museum, a place where it would be seen and studied, where its story could be told properly. I wanted it restored not to be a rich man's trophy, but to be a public lesson in genius and beauty. The lawyer was stunned into silence for a moment. He told me people don't just give away fortunes like that. I told him it wasn't a fortune I was giving away. It was a ghost. And it was time for it to stop haunting barns and start inspiring people. I was just the caretaker, the man who had opened the door. I had only one condition. It was not negotiable. I told the lawyer that next to the finished exhibit I wanted a small, simple brass plaque. It couldn't have my name on it. I didn't want the credit or the fame. That was all just more noise. The plaque had to have just 9 words on it. 9 words that held the entire meaning of the last 50 years of my life, the entire reason I'd bought this wreck in the first place. The plaque had to read, "For Eleanor, who always believed in forgotten things." That was it. That was my price. It was my final conversation with her, a public testament to the quiet, unwavering faith she always had in me. She was the one who saw the man, not the grease. She was the one who understood the beauty in the broken things. This entire journey, from the moment I first saw the ad to this final decision, it was all for her. The world could have the car, but the dedication, that was ours. The process was done in absolute secrecy. The lawyer set up a blind trust to handle the donation. Papers were signed by proxy. Arrangements were made for a specialized, enclosed transport truck to come late one night. During that time, my life went on as usual. Thomas called twice, his voice laced with that familiar, weary concern. He asked if I had thought any more about that Maple Creek place, and if I had a plan to deal with the situation in the garage. I just told him, "Son, I've got it all handled. Don't you worry about a thing." The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. There he was, trying to manage my final years in a sterile apartment, while I was, in complete silence, orchestrating one of the most significant philanthropic gifts in the history of the automotive world. They were so busy looking down on me, they never once thought to look at what I was actually doing. The night the truck came, I stood in the shadows of my porch and watched as they carefully loaded the chassis of the Argento Falcon. It was a quiet, professional operation, over in less than an hour. When they drove away, my garage was empty for the first time in months. The driveway was clean. To my neighbors, to my children, it would look like the old fool had finally given up, that he'd had his junk hauled away. They would think they had won. But I stood there in the quiet darkness, not with a sense of loss, but with a feeling of profound peace. I hadn't lost anything. I had saved everything that mattered. The real value wasn't in the $111 million. It was in the vindication of a lifetime of knowledge. It was in the silent, perfect justice of their blindness. They had laughed at a pile of rust, never knowing they were looking at a legend. I didn't need their apology. I had my dignity, I had Eleanor's memory, and I had a story that was finally, truly safe.